everyone, and welcome to the College of Education Research Roundtables. This event is brought to you by a collaboration between the Office of Research and Sponsored Projects and the Associate Dean for Faculty and Inclusive Excellence, Dr. Aisha Jackson. Our research topic for this afternoon is AI Unplugged, Artificial Intelligence in Research. We have an exciting group of panelists here to discuss. First, let me introduce you to the panelists. Dr. Kendall Hartley, Associate Professor of Educational Technology in the Department of Teaching and Learning at UNLV. We also have Kevin Sebastian, Teaching and Learning Librarian for Online Education at UNLV. Also, please welcome Dr. Jorge Fonseca, Assistant Professor in the Department of Computer Science at UNLV. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Dr. P.G. Trader, Professor of Educational Technology and Chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning at UNLV. Our discussion today will be in a roundtable format. We will ask panelists questions and build upon their answers into new questions. We invite the audience to post questions in the Q&A and in the chat. Audience members who would like to participate can add their questions in that way, and I will bring them up throughout the conversation or at the end during our Q&A before we end this session. It is now my pleasure to introduce our mediator for this session, Dr. Jonathan Hilpert. Dr. Hilpert is a professor of learning analytics and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Education. He will offer questions to the panelists while I will monitor the chat for questions and the Q&A for questions from you, from the audience. Dr. Hilpert.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Everyone knows that AI is an important topic in recent years, and there's been quite a bit of conversation about its impact on things like the economy and education and healthcare. But there hasn't been that much dialogue devoted to how AI impacts research, which is a critical area in the academy. So to explore this topic, we've prepared a series of questions, and I'm going to begin with a rather broad one to get started. And I'd like all four of the panelists to please give a brief high-level response so we can help the audience to understand your different perspectives. So the first question is, what is your broad impression of AI in different areas of society, and how do you see it contributing to or harming research at UNLV? I'm going to start with the first panelist on my left of the screen, so I'm just going to go in random order. So Dr. Schrader, if you could start with your response, and then we'll move our way through.
Sure. One of the things I've studied in my career is, in fact, the adoption and the integration of technologies across different areas. I think this is no different when we look historically at how folks have responded to changing tools. When we added calculators to classrooms, folks panicked. When we added spreadsheets to classrooms, they had similar reactions. That doesn't mean that everything works out great without thinking about the encapsulating contexts in which these tools show up. And there's a lot of policy discussion. There's a lot of implication discussion. There's a lot of things to unpack here that I think this is a really good first step. I am always in favor of finding ways to productively use tools, but equally so, know when and where we should use the tools. Another analogy I like to use is just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it's the solution. Let's use a cannonball as a fly swatter. Yeah, maybe it works, but it doesn't seem to be the right choice in all circumstances. And AI will actually, I think it's poised to do some amazing things, but there are some risks, and I think we'll find out what those are from our panelists if we're not careful, if we're not thoughtful and purposeful about what we do.
Yeah, Dr. Fonseca, what's your take?
Yeah, so the way I see AI is kind of like the Industrial Revolution, right? It's kind of it came in, not quite expected at the time, and some people benefit, some people do not benefit from it. And ultimately, I think it's going to impact every aspect of society, even if not directly, but in one way or another. And then particularly to research, I can feel that it can really augment the capability and capacity of people to do research But there's also the risk about authorship and all of these dangers that we have to be aware of, the ethical considerations. So whether we like it or not, it's going to come to UNLV to research, and it already is. And so I think that it's good to have the group of panelists that we have because we can see the different aspects of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation. I think we have a lot of different points of view represented. Kevin Sebastian, how about you as a librarian? What's your kind of broad take on AI?
Thank you, Dr. Hilpert. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So again, my name is Kevin Sebastian. I'm one of the librarians at the LEAD. Just to kind of frame my response a little bit. So I'm coming from this perspective of a practitioner of information literacy instruction, from a person who's interested in kind of digital learning, and a person who supports a lot of research instruction at the undergraduate level. So broad impression of AI. So we've kind of talked, the other panelists have already kind of talked about how paradigm shifting this new technology is, and how we're kind of in the midst of a technological reckoning, right? A societal level sort of technological reckoning. I'm reminded of kind of Socrates' critique of writing, right? So Socrates was like, "Oh no, writing, it's going to make everyone dumber," right? And I feel like this is sort of another version of that concern or critique of a new technology coming into that again sort of is paradigm shifting. So these conversations are cyclical, you know, with the invention of the printing press, with the invention of computers and the internet and the smartphone, right? So this is just another version of that, and perhaps is scaled in a different way because of access, the level of access that people have, and yeah, and so at UNLV and as a higher education institution, right, we also have to reckon with all of these big changes.
Yeah, no question. And I can't say that I'm a huge fan of the idea that history repeats itself or is cyclical, but it certainly rhymes, and it kind of feels like it's rhyming again right now. Dr. Hartley, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think as the senior member of the panel, I have to go back into history a little bit. I won't go back to Socrates, but certainly in my lifetime, you look at what we're now framing as general, or has been framed as a general purpose technology, a GPT, unfortunately, different type of GPT, but this is clearly a general purpose technology. And in my lifetime, I was lucky enough to, as a youngster, be able to do some basic programming on a TRS-80. So we're talking late 70s, early 80s. Well, it took us 20 years then for those computers actually to make it into general use in the household, right? So 50%. I was also fortunate enough, my first teaching gig was in 1993, which was the same year that a software program called Mosaic came out. Well, Mosaic was the predecessor to Netscape, and Netscape, of course, to Chrome and Internet Explorer. So all of a sudden we're grappling with that within schools. But the difference there was that came in 93, and by 2001, we basically again have that same level of penetration. Half the United States, at least, is using that. The next one comes in is the smartphone. And, Steve Jobs introduces this in 2007, and within 5 years, half of the population has a smartphone. And so again, massive change, right, in terms of what we're doing. So, but we went from 20 years to 8 years to 5 years. And now you look at generative AI, and this was November of 2022, right? So what, we're 20 months in, and we're already at least in terms of 18 to 19-year-olds, the latest data I saw was 43% of them have used generative AI. And then, of course, it's a little bit different than some of the hardware stuff. So you would compare it to something like Facebook. It took Facebook 4.5 years to get to 100 million users. ChatGPT did that in 2 months to get to 100 million users. And of course, you see, so this acceleration certainly history will repeat itself. It's repeating itself quickly. And this is going to be one that I think is just going to have incredible impacts in all facets, and research in particular, because I see it as that a general purpose technology, much like electricity or the steam engine. It just became something for everything. Well, how can it be used for research? Well, how can it not? How can it, given the things that it's capable of doing as an assistant? So I'm really interested to hear what others think and engage a little deeper in the implications for our work here.
Yeah, the pace at which it scaled is kind of jaw-dropping, and I think that's part of the the prima facie evidence for why we're all talking about it so much. So, Dr. Schrader, I'm going to start with you. You and I have had several discussions about how you're using AI on kind of a sort of like a daily basis, particularly with regard to preparing for your teaching. So I'm interested in your response to the next question, and then the other panelists, of course, are welcome to weigh in after you respond. But this question is, in what ways do you specifically see AI enhancing faculty research? And are there any examples that kind of come to mind?
Yeah, I think that from the perspective of a consumer, right? This is consumerist oriented, and there are a lot of different ways to frame the conversation. But as a consumer and subscriber of a variety of different approaches, there is an opportunity here to simplify and make considerably more efficient one's workflow, so that the higher level thoughts, the human agency in these ideas, you have more time, energy, and focus for those. I'll go back and use another analogy. Excel spreadsheets are just things, but what they can afford us in partnership with the technology actually exceeds what we can do very commonly alone, the spreadsheet on its own, or us with just paper and pencil. So in harmony and partnership, we actually accomplish a lot more complex ideation and thinking. In my teaching, I asked questions. I asked ChatGPT a few questions. I said, give me some ideas. And then in partnership, and again, this is where we enter in some of the ethical considerations on two fronts. One, what information goes into AI on the back end? Where were those tomes sourced? Are those tomes biased? But also, have I given over too much to the AI and not actually been a participant? So those are important considerations, and those same considerations, in my opinion, are just as germane when we start considering the research. So curating ideas, synthesizing ideas. From what I'm doing as an administrator, it's really a time saver. I get emails that are pages and pages long, and I say, can you summarize this for me? And now I can move on to another task. Now, if there are details in there I need to tend to, that's my job. That's my role.
Yeah, I hear that a lot, particularly with LLMs. The idea is that you can use them to enhance your productivity, to save time, to free up cognitive load. I think those are all, important points. Any others on the panel want to weigh in on how they see, AI enhancing faculty research with maybe a different set of examples?
I was just going to say one thing that I think is kind of understated is, I mean, it was kind of mentioned with the ideation, like, so, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the faculty at UNLV have a limited bandwidth because of all the things we have going on. And so a lot of the times, if you just want to sit and explore a topic, it can be very time consuming and you can get kind of sidetracked. And one of the great things of AI is you can have this conversation, which you can keep record of and refer back to as you're sort of pondering new ideas and potentially, obviously there's the issue with bias and the issue with hallucinations from the AI, but it can be very, very good at sort of tapping into a new area and sort of getting a kind of the basics of it and then proceeding to, look at a proper papers and whatnot. So it's very good at that sort of like initial brainstorming phase. And it's very powerful that you can just like pick up where you left off. So like maybe you have a little bit of time and then you can come back the next day and kind of explore that conversation further. So it can really sort of help to expand sort of the area that you're researching, and also sort of organize your ideas with that research.
You know, I hear the point about brainstorming. I use it a lot for that. I mean, so at what point in the future do you think we're going to get to a place where, you know, very little research, if any at all, is conducted without, you know, partnership with some type of AI assistant?
I mean, let's think about using Microsoft Word to write a paper. Oh, well, we CS people like to use LaTeX, but normal people like to use text editors, right? And so, I mean, how many people today do not use Microsoft Word or some sort of text editor when they're writing a paper? I would say it's a very, very few amount, and that's perfectly okay because, you know, I don't have to worry about English is my second language, and I don't want to have to worry about things like grammar and spelling sometimes or some words. I can just let my flow of information, you know, get into that paper. And so I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that even if AI completely takes over where you just have to use it for every single research, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the leading part of the research. It's just something to support you for that. So we shouldn't be afraid of that. And I think that it'll find its right place within that sort of pipeline.
Yeah. So for my next question, I'm going to kind of
Sorry, Jonathan, can I just extend something from what Jorge said there? I thought it was a really key point.
Of course, yeah.
And not depending on how much you've used these things, you may not be aware of the importance of sticking with that kind of conversation that you've had. He talked about, you know, asking some questions and then leaving off, and then you can pick up later on with that particular conversation. The great thing about most of these tools is the way they will kind of aggregate the conversation, right? And that includes possibly adding content to it. So that could be papers and maybe your own work and some of those types of things. That becomes incredibly powerful for individuals' research to have that kind of, you call it a conversation, or Google's now got this notebook LM. It's, you know, what used to be you and I would do for just a folder for a project, right? That we're throwing all these papers in. Well, you take that folder now and you turn that into a conversation. And that particular project, you have this thread that you can follow back through to help you. And I think it's tremendously valuable for that for researchers.
Yeah, Notebook LM's a valuable tool, and learning to train models properly is I think incredibly important skill. I noticed that ASU, for example, has a required course for all incoming freshmen on prompt engineering. It's unfortunate that UNLV has blocked our access to Notebook LM for use with our UNLV Gmail accounts. But I'm gonna pivot. It's just the other side of this question, and I'm gonna go back to you, Dr. Hartley. So I've listened to your interviews on NPR regarding AI and education, and I'm kind of particularly interested in your response to the next question. And I kind of think about this. I don't know if there's an English word for this idea that making something worse by trying to improve it. I don't know if there's a word for that, but I think that gets to the heart of what I'm trying to ask. And so what are the risks of using AI in academic research, and like what are the unintended or sort of negative consequences that it could have on our research environment that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, you mentioned the interview with NPR. That's over a year ago, so it was like a lifetime ago, right? So I'm not sure what I said then. I might contradict myself for sure. What are the risks? I don't know who I want to quote here. There's the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. I think probably some of the biggest risks we don't actually even recognize at this point. But let's say if we'll stay away from apocalyptic issues and talk about research. So I think there's a very serious, legitimate concern about your intellectual property. It's so easy now for somebody to take what you've done and maybe even submit it as a grant proposal or something and do exactly what I just talked about, but in a way that's really not ethical and not appropriate. And that is, you're asking the tool to utilize what somebody else put all this effort into to generate. Again, is it necessarily plagiarism? No. But is it ethical? No. Would we ever know that they did that? That becomes an incredible challenge. So the idea that you could somehow identify something has been AI generated or based on something else. Jorge can probably speak better this than me, but as far as I can tell, it's an arms race that nobody's going to win in terms of identifying whether or not something is AI generated, and what exactly it's based on, right? And this is getting its way worked through the courts right now in terms of what the content that's being used to develop these models. Do they extend? Do they go beyond their rights in terms of using the work that's in there? So that's certainly a risk. Is thinking about intellectual property in a broad range of things.
So where do you think, just from your own point of view, the ethical boundary is on content that's been produced in collaboration with a generative AI tool?
One of the ways I think about this is, so there's kind of the knee-jerk reaction is it's you used AI, that's unethical. You've somehow misrepresented. But in some ways, AI replicates what we're doing, right? Like what we've done as professionals growing up through our field. I've learned from Bandura, I've learned from John Sweller, I've learned from all these folks, and all that has kind of become this kind of corpus of what I understand and what I do, and so I spit that out. Well, these LLMs have done a similar type of process, right? Where they've learned all of these things from all of this existing content, existing understandings, and they bring it and then they spit it out in a new and novel way. I think so you set that aside, the question of how they got their content. The other is, how do you think about the role of it? And I don't see how we don't continue our work with AI as an assistant, as a collaborator, as a Jarvis in the Iron Man series. This thing that's there with us and just constantly helping us do the things that we need to do. I think there's a place for that. But then there is a boundary somewhere, and we need to kind of figure out what that is. It probably has to do with what we decide as an institution or an organization or even a society is, when have we deceived somebody else? So this all seems well and good as long as I'm open about how I used it. But if I've crossed the line where you were under the impression that I wrote this thing, and I actually did not write any of that, then there's a line has been crossed, right? But how do we figure out exactly what that is? It probably has to do with just being transparent as best as we can.
PG, Jorge, Kevin, if I point an LLM at, at a file structure full of PDFs and I use it to write a research article, have I done something unethical?
So repeat that again. So if you point the LLM to some paper, or what exactly?
So let's say that I use Notebook LM and I put a bunch of PDFs that I've looked up into it, and I use an AI assistant to call information from those PDFs to write a research paper. Have I done something unethical?
So there's a couple of different angles to that. First of all, let's look at it from the actual LLM. So who hosts that LLM? Who has access to that information? So the PDFs may or may not be copyrighted. So let's just assume that they were copyrighted. In that case, does the author give you permission to transfer that PDF to the LLM? That's kind of an ambiguous question. But even if you were to say in full control of the LLM, like a local LLM, I think that's a little bit more okay. But if you're using a web provided service, they could be using that as training data in the future, like for example, what ChatGPT does in some of the plans. And so there can be ethical considerations there. And then from the other angle, which is like what you produce out of that research, authorship again kind of comes into question, like Kendall was saying. So yeah, I mean, are you claiming you wrote it without assistance from the AI? Is that what the norm is? Which currently I don't think it is, but it could be someday. But at least for now, I feel like there should be some sort of credit given to AI. That's all I'll say.
Kevin, Sebastian, I'm going to kind of pivot to you. So for the next question, and I think you could probably, piggyback on what Jorge was saying, because I could see you nodding your head. So I think other ways that AI impacts research involves our access to and its access to information. So how do you think AI is impacting information retrieval, for example, like access to information from journals? Should AI have access to information behind paywalls? And do you think that AI, like a lot of people says, has the ability to create a more equitable information seeking environment?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Dr. Hilpert. And big question, right? And I think this is just a preface to all of my answers and maybe a way to kind of frame again this conversation, right? We won't have like the definitive answers after this conversation, and then perhaps what we're doing is and this is a pretty neat sort of adjective that I heard earlier from a webinar related to AI, and that we're kind of perhaps positing provocative statements about how we can shape the future of AI and all of these things. But to go back to your question, so there seems to be ways in which AI could tap into content behind paywalls, like academic journals. And I've heard that OpenAI, for example, has explored the idea of purchasing publishers in order to ingest all of that content that is ostensibly owned by that publisher. But the speaker said that it was too expensive for OpenAI, and so perhaps they have explored other ways of getting that information. Perhaps extrajudiciously was the word that was used. So meaning, like they knew that they were violating some sort of copyright and intellectual property law. And it's kind of interesting to note that on sort of the statements from these generative AI companies, the wording is publicly available information versus public domain or licensed information. So what does that mean? What does publicly available mean? Is it your ability to gain access to it regardless of copyright law? I don't know. But we know that these companies are ingesting information and data in ways that are problematic. We also have to consider that these are for-profit entities, right? So if they do in fact get access to paywalled content, they're not gonna, sure, the messaging would be, I think, that it would improve the information that they have, the knowledge that their LLMs are built out of. But surely too, as for-profit entities, they would figure out ways to monetize that, right? That it won't be free. That paywalled content won't be free. Is basically what I'm trying to say. And I guess to end this sentiment is that maybe if again, the way that we kind of talk about the future of generative AI is shaped with a more altruistic sort of thrust. Perhaps it would promote more equitable access, but I am I don't trust these for-profit companies enough to kind of make that to believe that. But I guess true equity, right, in research access requires more than just giving these AI companies access to paywalled content. There has to be like systemic changes, like movement towards open access repositories and open access publishing. I think is sort of not the alternative, but kind of could drive the philosophy around equitable information access.
I mean, I think the general trend is towards a more open access type world. And I agree with you about this kind of capitalist argument. I mean, the content can't really be free, and, money has to spend in order to make the information available. But I also kind of struggle with this notion that, AI to some degree or another is a representation of us and how we teach it and what we feed it. And what we're feeding it right now is just trash from the internet and crap from, say reality TV shows. And if we give it access to, scientific journals that, are, sort of based on, systematic inquiry and the smarter we make it, maybe the better off we're going to be. And that's a concept that I can't let go. Anyone else on the panel have anything to say about sort of, the the information retrieval side of AI, or what AI should or shouldn't have access to. And maybe this includes things like data that we provided. I have a lot of questions about what researchers on campus are doing with their data sets. If they feed a data set that has identifying information into ChatGPT-4, what happens to that information, and how have they actually shared it? I think there's a lot of data governance and a lot of data governance questions that we haven't answered at this university around how we treat AI as well.
But yeah, I wanted to, that is one of the pitfalls, and it was touched upon by all the panelists in this. So one, the analytic techniques that the AI leverages are based on potentially flawed data sets. Flawed data sets we're not super sure those are obtained legally, and those data sets may be furiously biased, like written in compartmental. So we're letting AI draw conclusions that we must actually engage in questioning. So that's one element. But the other element, we're talking about data in terms of text most of the time, right? We're uploading PDFs, and the ownership of those PDFs, the copyright of those PDFs, super interesting and valid point. But when it comes to like more data sets that I'm more familiar with, when it comes to large data, I have a long-term goal with what I want AI to do, and that is to parameterize prediction within like an ever-evolving system. I want to build analytic SEM techniques into the analysis of a video game and have just-in-time coaching. Now, here's the thing. Who owns the data once we're analyzing it? If I'm leveraging a server farm outside in Pennsylvania, and Microsoft has now, as you've seen in the news, who contracted a nuclear power plant just to fund this thing. Is that an ethical transfer of data? Does IBM, who is a for-profit, Kevin, you articulated this well, does IBM now own my data? How do I report that to IRB? That these data are potentially owned by somebody else, regardless of whether or not the data are sensitive. I think the university has some input on this notion that when research is conducted within the university, it's our IP. When I say our, I mean UNLV's IP. So these are, I think that it's understated to say that these are complicated. I think it's actually a lot more complex and nuanced than that. And you really have to open the things. Kendall, you mentioned that there are some pitfalls that we do not know what they exist yet, and we're entering into those. There's a lot of analytic tools, Power BI with what is it, Julius, and some other like data-oriented, data-focused statistical analytical tools. But once you send your data elsewhere, what does that mean? And who owns the results? Can you then publish those results if you're subscribed to another company? Is there an agreement there? Because those user agreements are very, very long. I don't read them all.
Here's a question that I've asked several people and I haven't gotten a clear answer to. So let's say I do, provide ChatGPT with a spreadsheet that has a list of names and student IDs in it. Have I sent the data elsewhere? And if so, where? And to what extent have I violated an IRB? What privacy concerns have I just introduced? Do any of our panelists have a clear technical answer as to what I've just done if I've exposed protected data to a public LLM?
So specifically for ChatGPT, right? So ChatGPT is constantly being updated in terms of training. And to train a model, the more data, the better. And Kevin has a great website he created that talks about this. And ultimately, it may not be, you're not necessarily training the model for students, but you might be just using that to augment its discussion capabilities. Does that mean that you can then retrieve the data later? Potentially, but not surely. Even the people at ChatGPT wouldn't be able to know that because of the way that the information gets converted into basically zeros and ones and then back into text. is very complicated, and there's not that much control in how these models could get basically created. Like neural networks and all this gets very technical, but there's no real control over like, oh yeah, this piece of data will remain fully intact. It's almost like you're dreaming. So if you look at a bunch of data and you have a dream about that data, there's some tiny little bits that you might remember, some stuff that will get kind of ambiguous, but it looks correct in your dream, but when you wake up, it makes no sense. It's kind of like the same way here. So because of the potential risk of it, you have to treat it like it's very likely to happen. It's like, what are the odds that you're going to crash in a car? They're very low, but that doesn't mean we don't wear seatbelts, right? We still wear seatbelts. So we're covering ourselves. And then I wanted to mention something that was mentioned a little bit earlier, because you mentioned the term like trash on the internet. And it kind of comes back into the same thing here, which is like, as humans, when we're learning and we're training ourselves as, growing up and we're learning how to speak and everything, we are able to prioritize and sort of separate data, useful information from the trash, basically, right? And we're able to do that. But it's a lot harder to do with something like an LLM, where there's some, weight and loss functions and things you can do to sort of prioritize certain groups of data, but it's very, very hard to take all of the data of the internet and then cluster it into these things. So the training is always complicated, and what I'm trying to get to with this is that you never know for sure how much something you feed it is going to eventually change the model. It's very hard to figure that out.
I also wanted to add that don't do that, right? Don't put personally identifiable information in a prompt. I think that that's just best practice. But maybe anonymize it in some way, as you would anonymize data when you're conducting a project that involves people. And just to continue sort of Dr. Fonseca's thought, right? And just to kind of go back a little bit. So in my engagement with ChatGPT, right, I'm paying for it just to kind of explore its full capabilities. There's a setting, for example, that says, don't use my conversations as part of the training model, right? Again, I get conspiracy theory hat, right? Like how much do I believe that sort of setting? Maybe it's like hidden somewhere in the user agreement. I don't know, right? So it's just something that I do. I don't put identifiable information there anyway. And I know that the New York Times is actually suing OpenAI because of they were able to prompt it to reproduce word for word a New York Times article. And this was maybe a year ago or something, December, I think, of last year. So perhaps OpenAI has rectified that it doesn't produce what they call plagiaristic outputs. But that again illustrates, it's still an imperfect technology, and there's so many things that we have to be careful of. That even though the promise of generative AI is to always produce something that's novel, perhaps, given this case from the New York Times, it could, credit card, if you for some reason put your credit card information on there and it might be reproduced elsewhere, I don't know. But all to say, just be careful with prompting, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think those settings in ChatGPT probably work about as good as Google incognito mode, All right, so the next question is going to be for Dr. Fonseca. So you and I met briefly at a meeting about developing AI courses for undergraduate students, and I'm kind of particularly interested in your question. So, what areas of research on campus at UNLV in particular do you think in the short and medium term are going to be the most impacted by AI? Where do what areas do you think are going to have the most where it's going to have the most immediate impact?
So I think there's two areas, and one of them maybe we wouldn't really think to be the case, but at least I didn't think it initially. But then I was like, yeah, no, actually, yeah. So one of the areas, and I'm not saying one is higher than the other, is going to be actually the creative arts, like fine arts and particularly visual and audiovisual content, because we're seeing, I know we're mostly focused on text generative AI, but there's also image generative AI, such as Stable Diffusion and other open source tools. And so the creation of art is already sort of just taking by storm the authors, and they have the same issues, whether like what kind of training data was used and all of that. But particularly for UNLV, you know, if you have people that are involved in, say, theater, and they're using inspiration to create a play, scenic design based, you know, and they're using the AI for research into that. For background, I have a PhD in computer science, but I have a bachelor's in theater and film. So I focused on scenic design. So one of the things that you do in scenic design is you're trying to sort of, you know, you read a play and you're trying to get the mood for the play and sort of understand like how you want to design it. And you could go into some books and sort of read about that, or go online and search some terms. But now with AI, you can really sort of take a basic, kind of guide yourself with text prompts and things like that, and interact and really create imagery and worlds that are brand new, because I mean you're creating them with AI, so it's truly original. But at the same time, it's truly original, so you're taking some other people's work away, and there's that. So that's one side. And then the other side, I think, would be basically like the STEM directly. Computer science, particularly, you know, AI is being used a lot for code generation. And so we have projects like web development, where you can really quickly create websites and do data analytics and all of these things. And not just saying that I'm focusing just on computer science, but as we apply to other areas, like we're helping medical people, or, you know, math people and those kind of things, that it's sort of expanding. So I think those are the two sort of big areas where, for research and just productivity, it's really affecting. But like I said, I think that indirectly it's everywhere.
To your point about, you know, image generation and, you know, sort of like arts and the visual arts in particular, I've tried DALL-E, I've tried Midjourney. I find upsides to both of them. Probably like Midjourney a little bit better, but there's no illustration of AI, like you were talking about, as producing a type of dream than when you get into image creation with AI. It's the downside to that, though, for me, is that I find it very difficult to generate graphics and images that will work for like publications. So it definitely wants to introduce a kind of novelty, no matter how you prompt it, that isn't terribly conducive to, you know, sort of like producing graphs and figures that can be, you know, sort of illustrations of data.
Yeah. And if I'll add, you know, I always think of the AI like dreaming, because it's like images you would think of in a dream, but like if you were to actually show somebody, it's like there's weird flaws. Yeah. And I mean, maybe that's where AI and the arts can coexist. The AI can sort of make that blueprint, but you still need an artist to then actually make that into something that is, you know, able to be published or displayed and whatnot. So there's that augmentation, and that could be sort of the you know, where AI can fit in that.
Yeah. And one more pragmatic point, I really wish one of those two tools would like allow me to, you know, disaggregate the images into layers. It's incredibly frustrating how I think like, you know, sort of archaic the outputs there are. Like I have to take it into Photoshop to take it apart, and that's no fun. Any of the others, PG, Kendall, Kevin, do you have sort of ideas about what the shorter or medium-term impacts of AI are going to be on research at UNLV campus in particular? PG, I see you raising your hand.
Well, I think there, like I've sort of compartmentalize some of the approaches and considerations with AI. So like as consumers, as generators, we can also develop AI systems to train them to do specific tasks, not necessarily intended by the original designers. We also have this role in an institution to coach new researchers. And in that role, I think it is essential for us to not only discuss, as we're doing now, what the university and what we feel are the parameters in using AI as a partner, but also coaching, training, and unpacking that for them as well. So I think it is essential that we stop ignoring the conversation in classes, which this is what our approach currently is, for most of us. I'm not saying all, and instead start with an AI disclosure requirement, that AI isn't some sort of cheating, rather use it. Here are some suggestions on how to use it. So let's train our folks on how to do this. How can you synthesize articles ethically, and do it in a way that it is a partner? Now, there are some subtle issues that I haven't even attended to before talking and hearing from some of our panelists here, but I think they're really useful things. And this is the only way we're actually going to help our future researchers when they come to it, like coming up with ideas, ideation, and in partnership with and in harmony with these tools. That's a great boon. But knowing what it means to generate a junk abstract that you haven't even reviewed, well, that's a different sort of problem altogether. And if we don't do anything, that's what we'll get.
Kendall, hot take, research?
Well, yeah, it could go a lot of directions. I mean, obviously, I'm interested in it. I've been since since I taught high school in the idea of the independent student learner, and their own self-regulatory skills and what that means for learning. So I'm fascinated by the potential of an AI to basically be that coach or partner with them. But if they are, what we deem low in terms of self-regulatory skills or capacities, they're probably going to use it poorly, right? And so we're back to the same problems that we've had with other generations of technology. If they are well self-regulated, then they're going to actually use it quite well. They're not going to just go have it write papers for it. They're going to use it in a way that'll help them understand difficult concepts and maybe visualize things in a new way. And I think of my son was doing physics, a year and a half ago, and I was like, you got to check this out. This can really help you understand some of this. Won't answer will answer your questions. It will try to, but it can explain concepts in a way that are going to be very helpful for you, and maybe in a way that's better than, no offense to all of us PhDs, but sometimes we see things from a different angle than these undergrads do, and they better understand sometimes physics concepts from one of these text tools. So
Yeah. Kevin, Sebastian, how long until every ninth grader is using AI as a writing assistant to produce an English paper or some Python code? And does it equitize, or do you think it increases the differences between the haves and the have-nots?
Great question, right? So I think an important part of your question is access to the technology, right? When we think about the digital divide, like who's able to pay for certain technologies, the quality of those technologies, it could potentially exacerbate, the haves and the have-nots. As to your question about when ninth graders would rely on it for all of their research, I don't know. But I do also want to kind of mention from an information retrieval standpoint, right? And generative AI, and there are tools out there already that could help augment parts of the research process, like literature reviews and maybe even like a systematic review, right? But there are, of course, limitations to the tools that we currently have. So like Elicit, for example, only takes from the Semantic Scholar database, and so could miss, a huge swath of other sources. But it could help automate sort of the drudgery of kind of looking for articles that are related to a particular research inquiry. So I think there is that danger of also kind of just like depending on the AI doing the work for you, and might lead to a superficial engagement with kind of what it is that you find, because you're or uncritically evaluating sort of the articles that you find because AI has determined that it's related or what have you. But yeah, lots of different things that we have to kind of consider.
Well, I can say this, if I have to choose between using an AI assistant or trying to decipher what a bunch of like PubMed mesh terms mean, I'll take AI every day. So let me ask the panel this question. And I hear this conversation a lot at kind of higher levels at UNLV. So there's this notion that we should be developing AI tools, like new AI tools at UNLV. Or maybe there's this other notion that we should be using AI in a more applied type fashion to improve workflows and kind of the output. And I wonder what your take on it is. I mean, do you think that UNLV can compete with, private companies when it comes to developing AI tools? Should we even try? Should we be relying upon it for other things to improve more traditional academic outputs?
So I'll jump in and say something brief. So, I mean, generative AI, ChatGPT, all these things, they came to be because, and I think 2019, 17, there's a paper that was published about transformers. The paper is called something like "To Get Your Attention" or "A Way for Attention," something like that. And I should know that, but I don't know the exact name. But that was just an academic paper. Now, it was published by Google Brain, but there was somebody from University of Toronto in that paper. So from a research perspective, I mean, I think academia still has some, has a place to advance these fields, and they should be trying. Of course, we're not going to make ChatGPT at UNLV that's going to be superior to that because we don't have the funding to train those kind of models. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to advance in specific areas, whether it's application-based and whatnot. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. No, in true Canadian fashion, they helped invent AI and then they exported all the raw materials. Kendall, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I would echo that. You think back to, again, the historical view. So you think of Mosaic, that was actually built by a couple of programmers at the University of Illinois. They didn't build the internet, but they did actually build basically the pipeline, the World Wide Web in some way, shape, or form. And Tim Berners-Lee also at CERN had a hand in that too, in a way. But these are individuals that essentially, education research facilities. So we absolutely have a role to play. It's not super clear. If it was really clear what it was, somebody else would do it already. But we're the right people to be thinking about it and trying it and figuring out. I'm really fascinated by things like GPTs or using the OpenAI API to do things the way that you and I have talked about in terms of encouraging self-regulation, and how could you put guardrails and or guidance around one of these existing tools to better support our goals. There's all sorts of places in probably each of our fields worth exploring and contributing.
Agreed. And then I'll move on to our last question, and then we'll make some time for audience questions. But this is one that's kind of curious to me that because of my position within the college. I wonder what AI's role is going to be in activities like writing grants and seeking funding in the future. So, I can envision a time where it's going to be very hard to be competitive in producing high quality grants and securing extramural funding without, leveraging AI in some way, shape, or form. So I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of using AI to seek extramural funding, to produce grants, to monitor budgets. I mean, any aspect of the grant funding process, and kind of how you think AI is going to play a role.
I'll start. So it's already been used, as far as I know. I don't want to confess the things I might have done myself, but I think that there's two aspects for grants that are very useful in AI. One of them is AI's capability to do scraping and to be able to read a call for funding, and then be able to sort of, if I train the AI, like this is my field, this is what I do, this is the kind of funding I'm interested in, then I can just be like, check this and compare it to what I like. And then it can tell me if it's something relevant. And of course, OSP, we have all these tools already that do have those kind of things in there. You get those newsletters with the specific grants that might be relevant to you, but this is another layer to that. And it's a layer that even they could actually put for us as well. And then of course, for the grant writing, I mean, I think it's kind of becoming obvious that it can really help us augment writing in general. It can help us with the technical component of reviewing things. And then you could use it to generate images for potentially adding to your grant. Like maybe you need a dashboard, you want to use like a prototype, then you can, whip something up really quickly there. So where you have to be careful is with the hallucination aspect. It's very easy to try to have, if you just make the AI just write pieces of your grant, it may reference things that don't exist or mention things that are impossible. So there has to be a time and a place, and there has to be some oversight.
PG, Kendall?
Yeah, I think there's I mean, as many ideas as we've shared in this conversation, there are that many ways you could probably leverage the tool, as Kendall articulated well. I think this is just a general purpose tool. I'll give you an example. You've written an entire proposal, and when we write these proposals, we get deep into the weeds. We could just have ChatGPT say, provide a summary, and if that summary is aligned with what you planned, you're moving in the right direction. But if it isn't, there's some things you need to correct. Or you can ask it if there are things that might be missing. I mean, so it can actually help you edit in ways that, in our college, faculty have regularly requested grant proposal review, and we've got some mechanisms in place. And this is one that's readily available for those midnight hour writing sessions. Alternatively, monitoring the budgets and things like that. I'm a little concerned about hallucinating numbers. That's a concern of mine.
It hallucinates numbers all the time.
All day, which is interesting, but that's today's versions, right? So part of what we're talking about happens to also include the continued training and advancement of the tools, because it's a known problem and it's only a short amount of time before that problem no longer exists. So I think there's some planning, some preparation. I do worry, and I've heard rumors that folks have really leaned heavily on these generative tools to create the narrative, the structure, and the arguments when they had a seed of an idea, and then they just let this kind of do that. If you're a reviewer of a grant, it's going to probably sound neat and interesting because it is, as Kendall sort of captured, we are individually trained with a body of literature, and the body of literature in these generative systems is significantly more broad. So the novelty in the ideation when these systems are implemented, it certainly exceeds what I'm capable of doing on my own. So Bobby Fischer versus Deep Blue, it's hard to compete against all available chess games in history. And that's kind of where we might be seeing.
Yeah, the chess is a good metaphor. I mean, it used to be humans competing against, the computer chess algorithms, and now they just learn from them and wonder what they're seeing. Even when you watch chess on TV, it's mostly just announcers looking at what a chess algorithm is producing, like Deep Fish, and trying to figure out what it sees that they can't. It's almost comical. Kendall, so if you're reviewing for the NSF, are you concerned that somebody's using GPT-4 to pump out their grant narrative?
It's a tough question really for me. I might be a bit of an outlier. I mean, you think about like with my classes, I haven't really figured out how I'm going to approach, what sort of edict there should be, because at the end of the day, I want you to be able to produce X. I want you to say, let's say it's a website. I want you to be able to develop an instructional website that does X, Y, and Z. Which is a different objective than I want you to understand HTML. I want you to understand JavaScript, and I want you to understand that. So I have to be clear, what is it that I really expect? And if it's just a website, and they can actually use any of these tools to generate the code for the website, I have to really think about what is it I expected. And if I just expect them to develop a website, I don't see why I have a problem with them using the available tools, right? Not unlike, a math, again, we'll go back to our high school students. We want them to be able to understand something to the degree to which when they can use a calculator and when they can't. That's kind of the demarcation, right? So I want you to come up with a really, if we're going to send, $1 million or so to you, I want you to come up with a great idea. I want it really well laid out. I want a great plan that I can see. I want it supported by literature. Who do I expect does that? Is it, if Jonathan Hilpert submitted it, but it was ChatGPT that wrote it? ChatGPT is probably not going to implement it, but again, it's tough, right? It's really a difficult question, I think. So.
All right, well, I think that was a terrific discussion. April, I think we're at the point where we maybe want to turn over some audience questions. So I'm going to kind of give it to you to curate what was in the chat and to.
Yes, thank you. And I think I have a good question. It will be for all the panelists. I'm pulling into one conversation that started in the chat. And by the way, I just noticed I didn't introduce myself. So my name's April Fox. I'm a grant specialist at the Office of Research and Sponsored Projects. So I am living this reality of AI as well as a grant writer, as someone that writes grants, going into the weeds myself as a human in those weeds and looking for help. So I feel for all the points that we are bringing up in this conversation. Even though we had a recent win for humans, we were awarded with no weaknesses across all reviewers for the first time in history in an NSF, in a Department of Ed federal grant. So we're celebrating humans winning at this point. Maybe in the future, we'll celebrate humans winning with machines helping them, right? And then machines winning without humans helping them, right? And then, so the question from the audience is interesting, and it's essentially where we get into maybe more of a fun part in a way where it's like prompting. Tips, tricks, what works, what has worked, what doesn't work, what should I do? And I'll just start with you, Dr. Hilpert, and you can move to the next panelist, tips and tricks in prompting.
Well, I'm going to take the easy way out and give this one to Kevin Sebastian because I think he's the expert on this one, right? No? Prompting?
Not an expert, but there are some frameworks that I've encountered online about kind of optimizing prompts. So, for example, Google, for example, has crafted this thing called the parts framework for a prompt anatomy. So, meaning persona, aim, oh my goodness, what is the R? Recipient, T is theme, and then S is structure. So giving those things to a model helps with the quality of your output. So you give it some sort of persona. Basically, you're parameterizing, right, the response. You're giving a persona. You're giving the explicit aim of what you want to get out of the model. Who's the audience for whatever it is that you're working on, theming it in some way so that it's contained in its response, and then giving it an explicit structure. There are also other kinds of prompting techniques, like, so if you just give a prompt to a model, it's called zero-shot prompting, right? Not giving it an example. And then one-shot prompting is giving it an example of what you want. And then it sort of mimics that. And then there's also chain of thought prompting, where you kind of lay out a process for the model to kind of follow when you're prompting it. And then there are other frameworks that we don't need to get into, but those are just some tips.
Yeah, interestingly, the latest OpenAI model now is implementing, as Kevin described, this chain of thought model within itself, right? So all these questions that we ask, what do we need to, what are your suggestions for this or that? Well, it's often being addressed by the tools as they develop. It's worth noting these are the worst tools we'll ever see, right? That we have right now, because they're going to continually improve. And so when it comes to, prompt engineering we were going to have certificate programs and this stuff, and then we realized that, it wants to better understand your question. But you often get that feedback when you get the response, like, oh no, that's not what I had in mind. And so then you're engineering in real time. But it's fascinating to think about where this is going. And so if they're trying to get to where we just ask the question, well then we question with prompts, but this next one is already doing the chain of thought reasoning for us. The next step, of course, is it's just going to read our mind and give us our question, our answer before we ask the question, which, I mean, it's based on what, the behaviorist perspective too. You can predict a little bit about what we're going to ask next, based on what we asked in the past. So
we just have to think about it. Yeah. April, you want to ask another?
Yeah, we have another interesting question, again, in this sort of tips and suggestions area. What are you using today if you are working with students, or if you are recommending, someone that is wanting to use more of AI with, a classroom and move sort of a group of students into that area? What kind of tools are you recommending? We talked a little bit about the processes, but if you have any examples of a recent case that you have been through with students, and did they get things straight away? Did they have a hard time? Where did they have a hard time? So that other teachers, other educators, other faculty around the university can pick up on your cases and do it with their groups as well.
I'll start with that. So it's going to depend on the discipline, of course. But I think that for the majority, there's a benefit to, like ChatGPT, as long as you state the expectations ahead of time. I think that, well, what was it? There was a second part to your question. I just want to make sure can you repeat that part? I want to make sure I got that.
Yes, first, so I think a few parts, which tools are you currently recommending for students? If you can name what you're recommending. Two, if you have any cases that you remember where you were working with students that were new to AI, and how did that process go with them? Because educators have this, they want to know, be prepared. So something that could prepare an educator. And yeah, so those two parts.
Yeah, so I think that here's a scenario that happened to us. So this is with programming specifically, right? So nowadays there's code completion, right? So you start writing a line of code and the AI will finish that line. It can do more than that, but typically that's just like the very basic level. So it's a great tool when you're teaching, and when when the student is struggling to remember something, like it's great that they can see the remainder. It's kind of like triggers part of their brain, like, oh yeah, this is the rest of the line. But at the same time, there's risk with these kind of tools where you can't completely rely on those if you're learning how to program. So we were using a specific tool, Replit, which does that. And what we found is that while it was great when you're learning the language, it wasn't so great if you use it while you're taking an exam or while you're doing an assignment, because it could be alluded to be cheating if everybody has the same completion. So then people think, oh, did you copy from someone else? Well, no, it's just the AI suggesting the same solution. And so what I really want to say is that in our specific case, you got to make sure that not only do you use the tools and you specify what the tools are for, but you also specify what they shouldn't be used for. Because the same tool that can benefit some parts of your class can also cause problems in other areas. And of course, this is just in computer science. But I do think that ChatGPT can really help other disciplines as well.
I wanted to ask Kevin. He mentioned illicit, and I know I've tried Perplexity. I've been pretty disappointed with that. When it comes to these tools for research, that you obviously want citations and some preferably correct citations. If you have recommendations of that kind of ilk of the illicits, the Perplexities, and others.
Let's see. I mean, like ChatGPT, for example, generative AI in general, probably not the best, right, to go to for trying to retrieve information. And you probably want a tool that is kind of tailored to that specific function, like elicit. Like I mentioned, I think the limitation to elicit is that it's drawing from the Semantic Scholar database, which is kind of while broad, right? While it has a lot of publications in it, and it's still, just a fraction of all of the literature that's out there. There was one that we were able to kind of get a trial for this past summer. It's called Scopus AI. And they said that their database for sources was much larger than elicits. By how much, I don't know. And that trial has since ended. But if there's interest, perhaps, maybe folks can advocate for it, because we certainly need something like that that retrieves, specific articles, sources that are not hallucinated. Just one more thing, the discovery layer, or the platform that we use at the libraries to find articles, right? Quick search. I was looking at the roadmap. So Primo is the name of the technology. I was looking at the roadmap, and earlier this year, they said that they were coming out with some sort of integrated generative AI searching tool similar to Elicit and Perplexity, and kind of embed that into quick search. But I haven't looked at whether or not they're staying true to their timeline of sometime later this year. So at this point, I can only think of, I guess Elicit is sort of like what's up there, but I may have missed a tool.
That's really helpful. And the scope, I would be one that says, the Scopus database I'm very familiar with, and if I could use an AI tool that mined the whole Scopus database, that would be fantastic. Because what I found with Perplexity and Elicit is, like I said, it's somewhat superficial. They're just going after stuff that's open. And I just want to make one other comment related when it comes to advocacy, or there was questions in the chat about why don't we have an education version of this at UNLV for OpenAI and all these related things. There is a faculty senate working group. Actually, I don't know, maybe Jorge or Kevin, are you a part of that? Jorge's probably, okay, he's a part of that. And I know Bartuya Sharian was at least co-leading it at some point. I would reach out to those folks and let them know what your interests are, because I think they're going to come out with at least some recommendations that will likely get the attention of the administration, especially particularly as it comes around to resources too, right? Do we want to have something like a Scopus AI? Do we want to have access to OpenAI education? Some of these types of things, that might be a good group to connect with.
Yeah, both Kevin and I are actually in the AI task force, and one of the things that we were looking at, the task force was created earlier this year, and we, the main focus was how can we support our faculty in terms of things like syllabus language and guidelines, and there's a lot of work still to be done. And I mean, I wish we had money to buy all these great tools. We can recommend, but it's ultimately going to be up to UNLV.
Yeah, I think with this question, we are reaching the end of the the Q&A. If you have sent a question and we haven't got to your question, we may get back to you on it. Please share your email if you'd like us to get back to you on a question. And yeah, I'll pass the wording into Dr. Hopert. I'd like to also thank all the panelists for being with us. And yeah, any last comments before we end this session?
Well, hearing none, I'd also like to just thank all 4 panelists. I think that was a terrific conversation. We all benefited from, your expertise and your insights. And so thanks for making this a great first College of Education Roundtable. And thanks for all the participants for coming and participating.